Today we're going to be painting in our 3 flamingos onto our final painting. I always do a practice before I do my final one, so if I have any mistakes, I know what I need to change before I apply it onto here. So that piece of scrap paper that you guys have over here is a great area that you could, transfer on one of your flamingos. Practice it first before you put it onto your final, because there's things that happen on here that I want to avoid when I do it onto the final piece. We're going to be mixing 4 colors for our flamingos, and the first one is going to be a combination of magenta and alizarin crimson. We want this combination to not be watered down at all. It should be a high concentration because that's how we're going to get those really nice vibrant red hues in our flamingo. So after putting some red on there with the magenta, and we're going to be mixing equal portions of magenta and crimson red into one another to create this really nice intense pink. Like I said, we don't want to water it down too much. It should be a nice thick concentration of pigment. For our next color, we're going to create a tint of this hue. So let's remix it again over here by combining equal proportions of alizarin crimson and magenta. But this time we're going to add water to it. And because we're adding water, we don't need too much of the pigment because we want to dilute the water, or dilute the pigment, excuse me, to where we are creating a tint. Test the tint on your scrap paper to make sure that it's not going to be too dark. We want this to be a nice light pink, as this will create the lighter values on our flamingo bodies. For our third color, we're going to be mixing the underbelly color of our flamingos. For that, we're going to be doing equal proportions of the alizarin crimson and then also the magenta. And then to give it that nice neutral tone, we're going to add in a little bit of the burnt sienna. You'll notice that adding in this burnt sienna has gotten rid of the intensity of that red, and it's now a much more muted tone. Remember, tone is a diluted dull version of our hue. You can create tones by adding neutrals, complementary colors, or grays. And so here we're just adding in this neutral. Okay, test sample that color, make sure I'm happy with it, which I am, and now we can begin painting in our flamingos. To paint in our flamingos, we're going to be using the wet on wet technique and doing variegated washes within the shape of our flamingo. To begin, make sure you get a clean cup of water and carefully place in water inside the flamingo body. Anywhere you've put water, that is where you're going to have pigment. So if you have white areas, like on this upper backhand portion of this flamingo, it's supposed to be white. So I'm not going to put water there because I don't want my pigment going into that section. But to end that water shape, I'm going to try to create the illusion of feathers by creating like these little tiny angled lines. So it's not like just like a flat line that's just ending into those highlighted areas. I'm also going to do this little ends of, or the top parts of the leg. You shouldn't have a puddle. You should just have a wet, damp surface. Okay, next thing is we're going to paint in our colors from light to dark. So I'm going in with my tint of pink, and I'm going to just place it in as little tiny dots. When I get to the area though, that is more of where I'm seeing my feathers, I'm going to paint the pink in as little tiny streaks to help portray this illusion of feather. So I'm doing a streak here, streak there, pops of the pink down below, and then on the left-hand side of the legs, because on the right-hand side it should be a highlight. Now I'm noticing I have a lot of water piling up now on my bird, so I'm going to clean off my brush to where it's just damp, and I'm going to do some lifting off techniques where I'm lifting off the pigment to where it's supposed to be a lighter value pink. Lifting off is also helping me lift off any extra water on my flamingo, and this will help my colors bleed into one another a little bit more and not just create a puddle. Okay, now that I put the light pink in, I'm going to slowly build up to my darker colors. I'm going to use my tone next. I'm going to place the tone on the bottom right-hand side of the neck. As well as the underbelly area of my flamingo. And the left-hand side of the legs. I'm okay with it kind of flaring out like that because that's how I'm going to create that illusion of feathers. Next, I'm going to start putting in my most intense pink. For this, I want to make sure that my brush is not that wet because I just want little bits of color. And I'm going to start painting these in as little tiny strokes or dabs on the very end of that wing to get those colors to start popping through. I'm also going to thin this out with just a little bit of my water from my tint. I'm going to add some deeper pinks in the neck area here to build up my values to make it look more three-dimensional. I'm also going to create this middle value pink, so I've combined a little bit of the tint, a little bit of that magenta and crimson red mixture. And I'm going to paint in like my middle light value tones. I'm just going to double check that on my scrap paper. It's a little dark, so I'm going to lighten it up just a little bit more. And notice I'm not really overworking my flamingo. I'm letting the pigment kind of spread out on its own. And now I'm going to paint in some layers of feathers, just as these very subtle streaks. Really trying to make sure I'm not overworking this surface. Here we see a little bit more of an intense pigment. I'm going to add in some pink here on the very end of this tail. I'm also going to create a darker version of this tone by adding in a little bit more of the magenta in there, and that's going to help create some darker values that we're seeing, especially here on the neck where we have like a little bit of a core shadow. I'm just going to dab that in. We have a little bit of a core shadow underneath the leg, but that color is getting a little too intense. So I'm going to add a little bit of the burnt sienna just to tone it down a little bit. And once that's toned down, I can add that on the left-hand side of this leg as well. The underbelly here. I'm just doing little tiny splotches to help build up that range of values. And I'm just gonna leave it. We're gonna leave this how it is. I'm really happy with it. If I want to maybe create a little bit more of like a feathery look in here, I'll do a little bit more lifting up with my brush to create those lines. I don't want to do it too much though now because I'm starting to notice that the fibers of the paper are starting to get lifted up. And the nice thing is as this dries, the pigment is going to spread out at a less amount. So like here, I can even dab in a little bit more of this pink right on the edge and give it more of that streaking look for the feathers. It's not going to flare out as much because my watercolor in those sections are starting to dry. So there we have it. I'm gonna end there. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm sorry, I'm gonna lift up just this highlight on the left hand or right hand side of each leg to pull out that three-dimensionality that we're seeing. So here's the key. If you want your flamingos to look really three-dimensional, you wanna make sure that the values on the forms are correct. And if they're not matching the value in the photo, then you're going to need to adjust it. And now I think I will stop and I'll start working on my next flamingo. I know I kept saying that I was going to stop, but I didn't. I just do want to mention that I did take a highly concentrated version of the crimson red and then some magenta. And then right before this was fully dry, I just added a couple little tiny dabs of that most intense color just to pull out the intense colors that we're seeing on the wing. For our next flamingo, we are going to want to paint this one. We want to avoid painting this flamingo as this one is still touching the one we've just painted. And if we would put water down, while this is still wet, the pigment from this neck is going to spill into this flamingo, and we're not going to get that nice harsh transition. So that's why we're going to be doing the one on the far right. Get a new cup of clean water, and we're going to repeat that same process again. This time, when you paint in the flamingo, you'll want to make sure that you're not painting into the eye, and as well as any highlights that you have on the body. Even though the head looks white, I'm still gonna add some water there. So my colors that I'm putting on the top part of the head and the back part of the head will blend really smoothly into that white area. If I would have just left that white, then it would have been a harsh transition from the color to the highlight, and I don't want to have that happen. Now in the back, this is going to be a much starker transition of highlights. So I'm going to start capturing those highlights in here by curving my brush strokes across the form. By curving my marks across the form, I'm helping to show the three-dimensionality of the form by showing how round it is by curving my marks. I'm also making sure that I'm not putting, my water into where I have my highlights. So be very, very cautious and paint what you see, not what you think you see whenever you're doing this portion of the flamingo. Keeping the whites of the feathers in this area is going to be really important. As you paint, make sure you're not creating a pool of water, just a dampened surface. Avoid pointing water where the legs are. We're just wanting to focus on the head, neck, and main portion of the body. Okay, so to begin, we're gonna take our little tint. We're gonna add it to the very bottom of our head here. The back part of the neck where it curves. Just making sure that this pigment fills out the head. I'm gonna start adding in this pink in little tiny strokes to start showing the illusion of feathers. Now that I have that in there, I'm gonna move over to my tone. I'm always gonna check it. It's a little dark, so I'm gonna create a slightly tinted version of that over here on the side. And then I'll start putting in my tones on the underbelly of the flamingo. I'm noticing that the tones are darker on the back right-hand side of the flamingo, which is why I'm putting more concentrated pigment there than I am in the front. Underneath this leg, there's a little bit of a darker value, so I'm just going to touch it there. And then we have some darker tones that are spilling out right around that neck again where we have that neck crease. As you can see, I'm just dabbing in the pigment. I'm letting the pigment work itself out and letting it blend into one another. I'm gonna start blowing on my flamingo body, mainly because my colors are really, really wet. And I don't wanna start putting in this bright pink yet because I don't want them to flare out too much. Okay, now that that's had some time to kind of dry up a little bit, I'll start tapping in my darker pinks. Oh, and you know what? I forgot to add in this tone here, right on the back part of this neck. You'll see that there's a little bit of a shadow, as well as right here in the front of the face. We have a little bit of a shadow there. Paying attention to the values and where they're supposed to be put is only gonna make your flamingo look even more three-dimensional. So it's very important to pay attention to the core shadows, like this light pink, or dark pink, excuse me, comes down into the center of the form to create a little bit of a core shadow there. Just gonna be dabbing in to create these little tiny illusion of feathers right here around the neck. A little bit of a separation here on the bottom where we see a little bit of a darker pink showing through. And now I can start putting in this dark pink where we have The feathers kind of combining together in this area, as well as larger strokes for the back where we're seeing those most intense pink feathers. All right, so now I'll really start concentrating this darker pink here where we have these back feathers that are really, really intense. I want to start building up my tone on the underbelly before that paint dries, so I'm going to add in another little bit of pigment there, as well as incorporating this color back into this portion of the neck to help darken that, to make that look more three-dimensional. I'll carry it through here to this underbelly section as well, because that needs to be a little bit darker. I'm squinting my eyes as I'm painting, and I'm assessing the development of my values. I'm noticing that that pink needs to be put in a little bit more, and I've run out of that color already. So I'm going to quickly remix it on my palette here. Remember, it's equal proportions of alizarin crimson and then the magenta. I'll just dab that in. Take your time. Don't rush this. And let the colors bleed into one another. It is hard to imagine what it's going to look like. Oh, and I just realized I forgot to put this little stroke of pink on the top. I'm gonna pull that down with the very tip of my brush. And it's hard to stop yourself from starting to keep putting in these little bits of color. I mean, it can be so tempting to just keep adding things in like I'm doing too, but I'm gonna need to stop at a point here soon, because I don't want to overwork my surface. So what I'm gonna start doing now is that lift-off technique. So here, it got a little too dark. I started losing my highlight that I need on the left-hand side of this neck. So I'm gonna start lifting off the pigment in that area to try to get that transition of value back in. I'll modify that color, trying to pull it out a little bit more. Even on the head there, try to lift up some of that pink. Get it look a little bit more white. One thing that I'm missing is more of that tone underneath the belly there. So I'm gonna just mix a little bit more of this, make it more of a tone, incorporating a little bit more brown. Just add that in. There we go, that's a much better transition now. So for right now, I'm just gonna let those colors blend into one another, and then whenever this starts to dry up a little bit more, I'll add in those little tiny bits of detail, like I did on the top portion of my flamingo, to really accentuate the little details that we're seeing here in the feathers.